Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Larry Parks Show. I'm Larry Parks, and we're going to be talking again today about malfeasance in the monetary structure and how ordinary people are getting ripped off by their pensions, their savings, and all their promises of future payment. I want to start off with something that I think is unbelievably shocking, and this appeared in yesterday's news item. Let's go to that first slide, please. This shows the top 10 money makers. Next slide, please. This shows the top 10 money makers in the hedge fund industry. And the very top guy last year, his name is John Paulson, made $3.7 billion for himself, not for his company, $3.7 billion for himself. And then George Soros, another hedge fund fellow, made $2.9 billion for himself in 1 year. And then another hedge fund guy, James Simons, made $2.8 billion for himself in 1 year. And then you have the rest, the rest of the top 10. But between these 10 guys, they made $16.3 billion. Come back to me, please. So in other words, these hedge fund guys averaged the top 10 hedge fund guys averaged $1.6 billion apiece. How does somebody make $1.6 billion? I mean, what product or service do they offer into the marketplace that they should be rewarded like that? I mean, did they invent something that was incredibly useful? Did they find the cure to some dread disease? I mean, what is it that they've done? And essentially what's happened here, and by the way, I mention these people by name because they're such big producers, they themselves have done nothing that's illegal or dishonest. However, the whole system is dishonest, and in effect, they're profiting from it. Now, the way this fellow, John Paulson, made his $3.7 billion for himself, and by the way, another $15 billion for his investors, is he made a big bet against the subprime mortgage crowd. So here you have on one side millions of people who are about to lose their homes, lose their savings and whatnot. And on the other side, you have fellows like John Paulson, and he's not alone, who he personally made $3.7 billion. But you have another bunch of folks that make billions of dollars essentially off the misfortune of all of these subprime mortgage victims. Where's the justice in that? Why should we have a monetary system that allows a small clique of financial elite people to profit in this way off the misfortune of millions of families? Something is seriously wrong here, folks. And there's other indicia as well, but this really it is so shocking. This is something that should really point it up to you. Well, at the heart of the incredible, unfathomable profits that, and by the way, that's just for 1 year. I mean, every year these guys make hundreds of millions of dollars, even billions of dollars. This fellow, John Simons, the prior year, he made something like $2 billion for himself. I mean, every year they're making this. At the heart of the dishonesty is the monetary structure, the system that we have for money in the United States. And all of our money is created flat out of nothing. Now, let me just show you a chart. Those of you who have been watching this show for a while have seen this before. Go to the next slide, please. This shows the amount of money that's been created in the United States since 1946. So all the way on the left of that slide, in 1946, the money supply, according to the Federal Reserve, was roughly $150 billion. Today, it's something on the order of $13 trillion. Went from $150 billion to $13 trillion. Come back to me, please. So where does all this money come from? How does this money get into the system? And this is something that people have a lot of trouble getting their arms around. And I'm going to explain it to you in a very simple way, but you're going to have trouble with it. And the reason you're going to have trouble with this explanation is that it's so simply outrageous. And so what happens here is that the banks create the banking system really creates all the money in our society flat out of nothing. The banks, private companies. So of that $13 trillion, the Federal Reserve, which is a private company, it's not part of the government, created something on the order of $900 billion, and the other $12.5 trillion was created flat out of nothing by banks, just by banks. So how do banks create the money? Well, before I get to that, I want to tell you about a fellow. His name is John Kenneth Galbraith. He died a couple of years ago. Arguably, he was the dean of the economic profession, a one-time president of the American Economic Association, was in charge of wage and price controls during World War II. I was a professor of economics at Harvard, wrote 40-some-odd books. When he died a couple of years ago, his funeral was broadcast multiple times during the day on CNN. That's how important this guy was. So in 1975, he wrote a book. The title of the book is Money, Whence It Came, Where He Went. And he talked a little bit about this money creation process by banks. And here's what he said. Go to the next slide, please. And this is a direct quote from John Kenneth Galbraith. He said, "The process by which banks create money is so simple, the mind is repelled." The mind is repelled. Come back to me, please. Well, what repels your mind? I mean, if you look at something that is just so awful, you just can't get your arms around it, you look away. It's like looking at some really terrible accident in the street or something, or like when the World Trade Center came down and people were jumping out of the windows. It was hard to focus on that. It was just so awful. The same thing with the money creation. I'm going to explain it again so simply to you, but again, the mind is repelled. And what I'm going to show you now are two quotations from Federal Reserve publications. I mean, this is not a secret. I mean, they own up to it. And here's exactly how it's done. Go to the next slide, please. And here the Federal Reserve tells you right out that money exists simply as a bookkeeping entry in a bank. A bookkeeping entry. And this is in a publication. It's called The Story of Money. It's geared towards children. It's in its 8th printing, and it's on page 17 where they tell you that. But then they have a much more erudite publication. It's called The Federal Reserve Today. It's in its 15th edition. It's produced by the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. And here they tell you right out, if the bank makes a loan, it credits the checking account of the borrower. And how does it do that? It just makes a book entry. This creates new money in the form of additional deposits for the borrower. Come back to me, please. So, in other words, what's happening here is the bank, well, I mean, they used to do it with a pencil and paper. They used to just make a notation. You know, they used to credit your account. Say if you borrowed $100,000, they'd write $100,000 down in your account, and that's the money. That's what a book entry is. Today, somebody goes to a computer keyboard. If you borrow $100,000, they type 1 and then 5 zeros, and the $100,000 is in your account. And essentially, on the other side of the ledger is your promise to pay it back. So in effect, on the strength of your promise, or somebody's promise, and most of the time, but not all the time, that promise involves collateral, which the bank will keep if you don't pay the money back and don't service the loan. On the strength of your signature, they create the money. So a few years ago, Donald Trump had borrowed, I don't know, I think it was $300 million on his signature. And there was a question about whether at the time the real estate market was tanking, whether or not he would repay the money. Just on his signature, the banks created $300 million. It was thereabouts. So let's think about this for a second. If you borrow, say, $300,000, say, to buy a house or whatever, and again, the bank creates the money flat out of nothing, just with a book entry, and then you don't pay your mortgage, the bank gets the house. But the bank didn't do any work to get the house. So in effect, they get the house just for making the book entry. I mean, where's the justice in that? So today, with the subprime collapse here, again, you have millions of people who are going to lose their homes now. These homes are going to go to the banks. And what did the banks have to do to get all the work and effort that went into building these houses? They just had to make book entries. What kind of system is that? And again, this is a system that rewards a small financial elite with unfathomable wealth. I mean, these are the folks who are buying, I used to say $150 million airplanes, but it turns out they're buying $300 million airplanes. And some of these $150, $300 million private planes, by the way, after they buy them, they're spending another maybe $100, $200 million to outfit them with saunas and hot tubs on the planes. I mean, they're done up like a palace.